The glass shattered before anyone understood why. Amara Bennett stood frozen in the middle of the restaurant, her hand still trembling from where the wine glass had slipped through her fingers. Red liquid spread across the white tablecloth like a wound opening slowly. Every head at the surrounding tables turned toward her, but she did not notice them. She could only see one thing across the room: Daniel Cole, laughing at something, his eyes locked on her, as if he had just seen a ghost. 3 feet away from him sat Malik Turner, Amara's date for the evening, wiping a napkin gently over her wrist, where a few drops of wine had splashed. He asked if she was all right. She nodded, though her voice would not come. Her mind had gone somewhere else entirely. Back 2 years. Back to every quiet dinner she had planned, for a man who never once looked at her the way Malik was looking at her now. Daniel rose from his seat without excusing himself to the woman across from him. He walked toward Amara's table, each step slower than the last, as though some invisible force was pulling him forward while his own sense told him to stop. He had not expected to see her tonight. He had not expected to see her glowing like this, dressed in deep green, her hair falling loose around her shoulders, a smile on her face that he suddenly realized he had never once put there himself. "Amara?" he said, his voice catching on her name. She turned to him, and for a moment, something old and tender flickered behind her eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by something steadier, something that did not need him anymore. "Daniel," she said simply. "It's been a while." It had been 3 weeks since she had stopped answering his messages the way she used to. 3 weeks since she had quietly closed a door that had been open for 2 full years. He did not know the size of what had ended, because he had never known the size of what existed in the first place. To understand this moment, one had to go back to the beginning, to a small office on the 4th floor of a marketing firm in the city, where Amara had met Daniel for the very first time. She had been 24 then, newly hired, nervous about proving herself in a competitive industry. Daniel had been the one assigned to show her around, a friendly senior associate with an easy laugh and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He had walked her through the office, introduced her to the coffee machine that only worked if you hit it on the side, and made her laugh twice before lunchtime. She remembered thinking, "This is a good place to work." She remembered thinking, "This is a good man to know." She had not expected to fall in love with him. It had not happened all at once, the way it does in movies. It had happened slowly, the way rust spreads over metal, so gradual that by the time she noticed it, it had already covered everything. She noticed it during a late night at the office when they were the only two left, working on a proposal that was due the next morning. She had been exhausted, ready to give up, and he had ordered food for both of them without asking what she wanted, somehow knowing exactly what she liked. She noticed it when he called her at midnight, after a rough breakup with a woman named Claire, needing someone to talk to, and she had stayed on the phone until 3 in the morning, listening to him grieve a relationship that was never hers to grieve. She noticed it, and she did nothing about it. Because Daniel had never once given her a reason to believe he saw her as anything more than a friend, a colleague, a person who was simply always there. For 2 years, she had built a quiet devotion around him that he never once questioned or examined. She remembered his coffee order without being told. She remembered his mother's birthday and reminded him to call her every year. She noticed when he was having a hard day before he said a single word about it, and she found small ways to make it easier. A joke at the right moment, a coffee left on his desk, a text asking if he had eaten lunch. She showed up to his sister's wedding as his +1 when he had no one else to bring, and she watched him dance with 3 other women that night while she sat at the table, smiling so no one would notice the ache underneath it. She told herself it was fine. She told herself that friendship was enough, that maybe someday he would notice, that patience was a virtue and love was worth waiting for. She had read enough stories, seen enough films, where the quiet, loyal woman eventually won the heart of the man who could not see what was right in front of him. She believed, somewhere deep in her chest, that her turn was coming. But turns like that do not come to those who only wait. They come to those who choose themselves first. Amara did not know this yet. She was still in the waiting years, the years where she measured her worth by how much space she could take up in someone else's life, without ever asking for her own. Daniel, for his part, was not a cruel man. He was simply an unaware one. He moved through life with the confidence of someone who had never had to work very hard to be loved, Women had always liked him, had always found him easy to talk to, and he had grown used to affection arriving without effort. He never once considered that Amara's affection might be different from the others, because he had never had to consider it. She had never demanded his attention the way the women he dated did. She had never made a scene, never issued an ultimatum, never done anything except be steady, warm, and endlessly available. And so, without meaning to, he had come to treat her steadiness as something owed to him, rather than something given. There was a night, about 1.5 years into their friendship, when Amara almost told him everything. They had been sitting on the rooftop of his apartment building, sharing a bottle of wine after a long week, the city lights spread out below them like scattered stars that had fallen to earth. Daniel had been talking about a woman he had just started seeing, someone named Priya, describing her laugh, her ambition, the way she challenged him in conversations. Amara had listened, nodding at the right moments, offering advice when he asked for it, and inside, something in her chest had cracked quietly, without a sound. She had almost said it then. The words had risen to her throat, 3 simple words that might have changed everything. But Daniel had kept talking, oblivious, already reaching for his phone to check if Priya had texted him back. And the moment passed, sealed shut before it could ever open. Amara swallowed the words down with the last of her wine, and told herself it was for the best. Timing, she thought. It was simply not the right timing. 6 months later, Priya was gone. Another name added to the list of women Daniel had dated and lost. Each departure followed by a phone call to Amara. Each phone call answered without hesitation. She began to notice a pattern in herself that she did not like. She was always the one who arrived first and left last. She was always the one who remembered, who noticed, who stayed. And Daniel was always the one who received, without ever once asking what it cost her. It was her older sister, Naomi, who finally said the words Amara had been avoiding for 2 years. They had been sitting in Naomi's kitchen on a rainy Sunday afternoon, Amara helping fold laundry while describing, in the careful, minimizing language she always used, another week of being there for Daniel through another breakup. Naomi set down the shirt she had been folding and looked at her sister with an expression that was equal parts love and frustration. Amara, she said, how long are you going to keep doing this? Doing what? Amara asked, though she already knew. Waiting for a man who isn't looking for you. You've spent 2 years being everything, to someone who doesn't even realize you exist as an option. You've made yourself so available that he never had to work to keep you, so he never learned your value. That's not love, Amara. That's habit. His habit, not yours. The words landed harder than Amara expected. She wanted to argue, to defend the 2 years, to say that surely something built over that much time meant something. But looking at her sister's face, she felt something old and tired rise up in her. The exhaustion of always giving, without ever once being asked what she needed in return. What am I supposed to do? She asked quietly. Just stop caring about him? No, Naomi said. Start caring about yourself the same way. See what happens. That conversation planted a seed that took weeks to grow. Amara did not make any dramatic announcement. She did not confront Daniel or demand answers about his feelings. She simply, quietly, began to change the shape of her own life, one small decision at a time. Decisions that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with her. It began with something as small as turning down an invitation. Daniel had texted her on a Friday evening, asking if she wanted to come over and watch a game, the way they often did. For 2 years, her answer had always been yes, automatically, without thought. This time, she looked at the message for a long moment before typing back that she had plans already. She did not have plans. She spent that evening alone in her apartment, reading a book she had bought months earlier and never opened. And something about the quiet of that night felt different from any quiet she had known before. It did not feel like loneliness. It felt like room to breathe. She began saying yes to other things instead. Yes to a painting class on Wednesday evenings that a coworker named Grace had mentioned. Yes to a weekend trip with 2 old college friends she had let drift away during her years of devotion to Daniel. Yes to staying late at the gym instead of rushing home in case he called. Slowly, without realizing it, she began building a life that existed independently of him. A life that had corners and rooms he did not occupy. Daniel noticed the change before he understood it. His texts to her began going unanswered for hours instead of minutes. His invitations were met with polite declines instead of automatic agreement. He assumed, at first, that she was simply busy, caught up in work or family matters, and he did not think much of it. He had grown so used to her constant presence that its absence registered only as a faint unease, something at the edge of his awareness that he could not quite name. It was around this time that Amara met Malik Turner. She had gone to the gym on a Thursday evening, one of the new habits she had built into her week, and had been struggling with the settings on a rowing machine, when a man in the next row leaned over and offered help without making it strange or forward. He had a calm, easy manner about him, quick to smile but not overly eager, the kind of confidence that did not need to announce itself. His name was Malik, and he worked as an architect for a firm 2 blocks from where Amara worked. They talked for 20 minutes after that first encounter, standing near the water fountain, long after either of them needed to. Amara found herself surprised by how easy it was, how Malik asked questions and then actually listened to the answers, how he remembered small details she mentioned in passing and brought them up again days later when they ran into each other at the same time each week. It was different from anything she had experienced with Daniel, not because Malik was more exciting or more handsome, but because he saw her. He noticed things about her without needing to be told. He noticed when she seemed tired after a long day and offered to grab coffee instead of asking her to entertain a whole conversation. He noticed the book she had been carrying around for weeks and asked what it was about, genuinely curious. He noticed her, in the quiet, consistent way that Daniel never had. Their connection built slowly, over weeks rather than days, through shared coffee after workouts, through a movie they both wanted to see, through late-night conversations that Amara found herself looking forward to instead of dreading the silence that followed. She did not rush into anything. Part of her was still cautious, still healing from 2 years of giving herself away for free. But Malik never pushed. He simply showed up, again and again, patient and steady, letting her set the pace. Meanwhile, Daniel's unease grew sharper. He began noticing Amara's absence more acutely, the way a person notices a missing tooth with their tongue, an emptiness that draws attention precisely because of what used to be there. He texted her more often, not less, trying to recapture the ease of their old dynamic, but her responses remained brief, friendly but distant. He told himself it was nothing, that she was simply going through a phase, that their friendship was too solid to actually change. But something in him had begun to shift too, something he could not yet name. He found himself thinking about her at odd moments, wondering what she was doing on evenings she used to spend with him, wondering who she was becoming without him watching. He did not yet understand that this feeling had a name, that it was the beginning of finally seeing someone he had overlooked for 2 long years. The restaurant that night was not a coincidence, though neither of them knew that at the time. A mutual friend named Priya, the same woman Daniel had once dated and lost, had organized a small dinner to celebrate a promotion, inviting people from their old office circle, without realizing that both Daniel and Amara, now with a new man at her side, would end up at the same table. When Amara walked in wearing deep green, her hand resting lightly on Malik's arm, Daniel felt something shift violently in his chest, a recognition arriving 2 years too late. He watched her laugh at something Malik said, a real laugh, unguarded and bright, the kind of laugh he realized, with a slow and sinking horror, he had never once managed to draw out of her himself. The wine glass slipped from her hand moments later, not because of anything dramatic, but simply because her fingers, distracted by the sudden weight of his stare across the room, had lost their grip for half a second. And in that half second, something in both of their lives quietly began to change. Daniel stood now at the edge of her table, the noise of the restaurant fading around him, aware only of the woman in front of him who no longer looked at him the way she used to. Her eyes held warmth, but not the old aching hope he had never noticed before. They held something calmer now, something that did not need him to fill it. "You look well," he said, because it was true, and because he did not know what else to say. "I am well," Amara replied, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet certainty that unsettled him more than anger ever could have. Malik reached for her hand under the table, a small, grounding gesture, and Daniel noticed it, noticed the way Amara's shoulders relaxed at the touch, noticed that this man beside her seemed to understand her rhythms already in ways It had taken Daniel 2 years and one lost chance to even begin recognizing. He wanted to say something more, to ask her to stay a moment longer, to somehow reclaim the ease they once shared. But the words would not come, because he understood, with sudden and painful clarity, that 2 years of comfortable oversight could not be undone with a single conversation in a crowded restaurant. "It was good seeing you," Amara said gently, and there was kindness in her voice, but also finality. A door closing softly, rather than slamming shut. Daniel walked back to his own table in a daze, aware that something significant had just happened, though he could not yet articulate what it was. He sat down across from the woman he had been trying to impress all evening, but her conversation now sounded distant, muffled, unimportant. His mind kept returning to the image of Amara's face, lit up with laughter that belonged to someone else. Across the restaurant, Amara felt her heartbeat slowly returning to normal. Malik squeezed her hand gently and asked, quietly, if she was all right. She looked at him, this man who had entered her life at exactly the moment she had begun choosing herself, and found that she meant it completely when she said yes. For the first time in 2 years, seeing Daniel had not undone her. It had, instead, confirmed something she had been slowly learning all along, that the version of herself who waited quietly in the shadows for someone to notice her had finally, gently, stepped into the light on her own. The evening continued, and neither Daniel nor Amara knew yet how much more would unfold between them before the story found its true ending. But something had shifted permanently in that restaurant, a shift that neither of them could take back, no matter how the following weeks would test them both. The phone rang 4 times before Daniel finally answered it, his voice thick with sleep, even though it was already past noon. "Did I wake you?" Amara asked, though 2 years earlier this call would have been unremarkable, a simple Saturday check-in between friends. No, I'm up," Daniel lied, rubbing his eyes as he sat up in bed. "What's going on?" There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that used to make Amara nervous, worried she had said something wrong. Now she simply waited, comfortable in the silence, letting Daniel fill it however he needed to. "Nothing's going on," she said eventually. "I was just calling to see how you were doing." This was, technically, still true then, in the earlier days of their friendship, back before anything had shifted. Let us return to that time, to understand fully how the pattern between them had taken root and grown, season after season, until it became something neither of them thought to question. It had started with small things, the way most patterns do. In the first few months of knowing each other, Daniel had been going through a difficult breakup with a woman named Claire, someone he had dated for over a year before she left him for a job opportunity in another city. He had been devastated, unable to focus on work, drinking more than he should have on weeknights, and Amara, newly hired and eager to be liked, had positioned herself as his steady support. She brought him coffee in the mornings without being asked. She covered small tasks for him at work when he was too distracted to focus, staying late to finish reports that had his name attached to them. She listened to him talk about Claire for hours at a time, night after night, offering comfort and perspective, never once mentioning that she herself might be interested in something more. At the time, she told herself this was simply what friendship looked like. She told herself that anyone would do the same for a colleague going through a hard time. But there was a particular tenderness in the way she paid attention to him that went beyond ordinary kindness, a tenderness she recognized in herself, but chose not to examine too closely, afraid of what she might find. Daniel, for his part, absorbed all of this, without ever pausing to wonder why a woman he barely knew was investing so much energy into his recovery. He simply accepted it, the way a person accepts sunlight or rain, as a natural condition of his life, rather than a gift being freely given. Months passed, and the pattern deepened. Daniel began dating again, first a woman named Sophia, then briefly someone named Elena, each relationship following a similar arc of excitement, complication, and eventual collapse. And after each ending, there was Amara, waiting on the other end of a phone call, ready to listen, ready to help him make sense of what had gone wrong. There was a particular evening, almost a year into their friendship, that Amara would later look back on as a turning point she failed to recognize at the time. Daniel had just ended things with Sophia, and he had shown up unannounced at Amara's apartment on a Tuesday night, looking for someone to talk to. She had let him in without hesitation, made tea, sat with him on her small couch as he explained everything that had gone wrong, how Sophia had wanted more commitment than he was ready to give, how he felt guilty for hurting her, but also relieved that it was over. Amara had listened, as she always did, offering gentle observations, helping him see the situation more clearly. At some point during that conversation, Daniel had looked at her and said, almost offhandedly, "You always know exactly what to say. I don't know what I'd do without you." The words had lodged themselves in her chest like a small, warm ember, and she had carried them for weeks afterward, turning them over in her mind, wondering if they meant something more than simple gratitude. She had wanted, so badly, for those words to be the beginning of something. But Daniel had said them the way one might thank a friend for driving them to the airport, sincere but ultimately unremarkable, forgotten by him almost as soon as the words left his mouth. This was the shape of their entire dynamic, repeated again and again, with only minor variations. Amara gave, generously and consistently, and Daniel received, comfortably and without much reflection. It was not that he was incapable of caring about her. He did care, in his own way, considering her a good friend, someone he trusted and enjoyed spending time with. But caring in the abstract is different from truly seeing someone, and Daniel had never once paused to ask himself what Amara needed, what she wanted, whether the balance between them was fair. There were moments when the imbalance became almost impossible to ignore, though Daniel managed to ignore it anyway. There was the night of his sister's wedding, a year and a half into their friendship, when Daniel had asked Amara to come as his +1 because he had no one else to bring. She had said yes immediately, spending an entire month planning her outfit, imagining, in some quiet corner of her heart, that the evening might become something more than a favor between friends. The wedding itself had been beautiful, held in a garden venue outside the city, string lights woven through the trees, laughter and music filling the warm evening air. Amara had stood beside Daniel during the ceremony, had danced with him during the first slow song of the reception, had felt, for a few precious hours, like she belonged fully in his world. But as the evening wore on, Daniel had drifted toward other women at the reception, dancing with a cousin of the bride, then with an old college friend, then with a woman he had just met that evening whose number he asked for before the night ended. Amara had sat at their table, smiling politely, watching him move easily from one connection to another, feeling the familiar ache of being present but unseen. She had not said anything that night. She had smiled through the ache, driven him home when he had too much to drink, and gone back to her own apartment alone, lying awake for hours, wondering how much longer she could keep doing this before something inside her broke. The answer, it turned out, was almost a full year longer. A year of continuing to show up, continuing to give, continuing to wait for a shift that never seemed to come. She told herself stories to make the waiting bearable. She told herself that Daniel simply needed more time to heal from his past relationships before he could recognize what was standing right in front of him. She told herself that some men were slow to notice what was good for them, that patience was a form of love, that her turn would come if she simply held on long enough. These stories were comforting, but they were also, she would later realize, a form of self-deception. They allowed her to avoid the harder truth, which was that Daniel had shown her, repeatedly and consistently, exactly how he saw her. He saw her as a constant, a fixture, someone whose presence he could rely on without ever having to work for it. And as long as she continued to prove that reliability, without asking for anything in return, he had no reason to see her any differently. It was during this second year that small cracks began to appear in Amara's patience. Cracks she did not fully register at the time, but which would later prove significant. She began noticing, with a sharpness that surprised her, how tired she felt after their conversations, how she often left interactions with Daniel feeling slightly emptier than before, having given so much of her attention and energy without receiving much in return. She began noticing, too, how she compared herself unfavorably to the women Daniel dated, wondering what qualities they possessed that she lacked, when in truth, the difference was not about qualities at all. It was about visibility. Those women arrived in his life, demanding to be seen, requiring effort and attention from the very beginning, while Amara had positioned herself as someone who required nothing, and so, naturally, received very little in return. There was a conversation, near the end of that second year, that Amara would later identify as the true breaking point, though its effects took weeks to fully surface. Daniel had begun seeing a woman named Priya, an ambitious and confident marketing consultant who worked with their firm on occasion. He had come to Amara's apartment one evening, full of enthusiasm, describing Priya's intelligence, her sharp wit, the way she pushed back against his opinions instead of simply agreeing with everything he said. Amara had listened, as she always did, nodding and asking questions, playing the role of supportive friend that she had perfected over 2 years. But something in her had shifted while he spoke, a quiet, cold clarity settling over her thoughts, even as she smiled and offered encouragement. She realized, in that moment, that Daniel was describing exactly the qualities Amara herself possessed but had never shown him, because she had spent 2 years being agreeable, available, and undemanding, believing that this was the path to winning his affection. She had made herself easy, and in doing so, had made herself forgettable. After Daniel left that evening, Amara had sat alone in her apartment for a long time, staring at nothing in particular, feeling something inside her finally begin to crack open. She did not cry, not that night. The realization was too large, too significant, to process through simple tears. Instead, she sat with it, letting it settle into her bones, understanding for the first time the true shape of what she had been doing to herself for 2 years. She thought about calling her sister Naomi that night, but decided against it, not yet ready to speak the realization aloud, afraid that giving it voice would make it too real to ignore. Instead, she went to bed early, sleeping fitfully, waking several times throughout the night, with the same thought circling in her mind like a slow, persistent current. She could not keep doing this. Something had to change, though she did not yet know what that change would look like, or how much it would ultimately cost her. The following weeks passed in a strange, suspended quality, Amara continuing her usual routines with Daniel, while privately turning over the question of what to do next. She still answered his calls, still offered support when Priya eventually left him, for reasons she did not fully explain, still showed up in all the ways she always had. But something had shifted internally, even if her external behavior had not yet caught up. It was during this period of quiet internal reckoning that the conversation with Naomi finally happened, the rainy Sunday afternoon in the kitchen, that would prove to be the true catalyst for everything that followed. Naomi's words, blunt and loving in equal measure, gave voice to everything Amara had been circling in her own mind for weeks, crystallizing a decision that had been slowly forming beneath the surface. That night, after leaving Naomi's apartment, Amara sat in her car in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes before starting the engine, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of 2 years pressing down on her chest. She thought about all the moments she could have spoken up, all the times she had chosen silence over honesty, comfort over risk. She thought about the wedding, about the rooftop conversation she had almost had, about every small sacrifice she had made in service of a hope that had never once been reciprocated. And somewhere in that 20 minutes, sitting alone in her car in the fading evening light, something in Amara finally settled. Not into anger, though anger was certainly present, not into despair, though grief for the years lost was there too. It settled, instead, into resolve. A quiet, steady determination that she would no longer measure her worth by whether Daniel Cole ever learned to see it. She did not know yet what this resolve would require of her, what changes it would demand, what new people and possibilities it might eventually invite into her life. She only knew, with a certainty that felt both frightening and freeing, that the version of herself who waited quietly in Daniel's shadow was finished. Whatever came next would be built on different terms entirely. The first real test of Amara's resolve came on a Tuesday morning, only 4 days after her conversation with Naomi, when Daniel texted her asking if she wanted to grab dinner that evening, the way they often did after a long day at the office. She stared at the message for a long time before responding, her thumb hovering over the screen. Every instinct in her body wanted to say yes, immediately, the way she always had, to fall back into the comfortable rhythm they had built over 2 years. But she made herself pause, made herself ask a question she had never thought to ask before. Did she actually want to go, or was she simply responding out of habit, out of fear that saying no might cost her his friendship entirely? She realized, sitting with the question, that she did not particularly want to go. She was tired, not physically, but in some deeper way, tired of always being the one who showed up, who adjusted her schedule, who made herself available. She typed back a brief message saying she already had plans, then set her phone down before she could change her mind. She did not have plans. She spent that evening alone in her apartment, and the quiet of it unsettled her at first, accustomed as she was to filling her evenings with Daniel's needs. But as the hours passed, she found herself reaching for a novel she had bought months earlier and never opened, losing herself in its pages for the first time in longer than she could remember. The quiet did not feel like loneliness. It felt, strangely, like room to finally exhale. This small refusal became the first thread in a larger pattern that Amara began weaving deliberately over the following weeks. She said no to a movie night, choosing instead to attend a painting class a coworker named Grace had mentioned months earlier. She said no to helping Daniel prepare for a work presentation on a Sunday afternoon, choosing instead to have brunch with two college friends she had not seen in nearly a year, friends who had slowly drifted from her life during her years of quiet devotion to Daniel. Each refusal cost her something, a small pang of guilt, a fear that she was somehow failing him by prioritizing herself. But each refusal also gave her something in return, a small deposit of self-respect that accumulated slowly, week by week, until she began to notice a difference in how she felt when she woke up each morning. Grace, the coworker who had mentioned the painting class, became an unexpected source of support during this period. She was several years older than Amara, recently divorced, and possessed a dry, observant humor that Amara found immediately comforting. During their second class together, as they cleaned brushes side by side at a shared sink, Grace had asked, almost casually, "Is there someone in your life who takes more than they give?" Amara had been startled by the directness of the question, but found herself answering honestly, describing Daniel in careful, measured terms, trying to be fair to him even as she described the imbalance she had finally begun to recognize. Grace had listened without judgment, then said something that stayed with Amara for weeks afterward. "The problem isn't that he's a bad person. The problem is that you taught him he never had to try. People rise to the expectations we set for them, and you set the bar so low he could clear it without even looking up." The words echoed something Naomi had said weeks earlier, but hearing it from someone new, someone with no personal stake in the outcome, gave the observation a different kind of weight. Amara began to understand that changing her own behavior was not simply about protecting herself. It was about finally setting an expectation, even if that expectation came far too late to change anything, with Daniel specifically. Meanwhile, Daniel's confusion grew steadily. He had grown so accustomed to Amara's constant availability that her gradual withdrawal registered first as mild irritation, then as genuine unease. He found himself checking his phone more often, waiting for her replies, noticing with a strange discomfort how much shorter and less frequent their conversations had become. He mentioned it, once, to a coworker named Ethan during lunch, complaining lightly that Amara seemed busier than usual lately, that she had turned down plans twice in 1 week for reasons that seemed vague at best. Ethan, who had known both of them for over a year, had raised an eyebrow and asked a question that caught Daniel off guard. "Have you ever thought that maybe she's just tired of being available whenever you need her, but not the other way around?" Daniel had brushed the comment aside at the time, insisting that Amara was simply a friend, that there was no imbalance to speak of, that she had always been happy to help him, and he had always been happy to have her around. But the question lingered uncomfortably in the back of his mind over the following days, surfacing at odd moments, refusing to be fully dismissed. It was around this time, roughly 3 weeks into Amara's quiet transformation, that she first encountered Malik Turner at the gym she had recently joined, another small addition to the new life she was building for herself. She had been struggling with the resistance settings on a rowing machine, growing increasingly frustrated, when a calm voice beside her offered assistance, without making the moment feel awkward or forward. "You've got the resistance set too high for that stroke rate," Malik said, leaning over slightly to adjust the dial. "Try it now." Amara had thanked him, expecting the interaction to end there, but Malik had lingered, asking a few easy questions about how long she had been coming to this particular gym, whether she had a set routine, what had brought her there in the first place. There was nothing pushy in his manner, nothing that made her feel pursued or evaluated. He simply seemed genuinely curious, comfortable with silence when it came, easy with conversation when it flowed. They ended up talking for nearly 20 minutes near the water fountain after their workouts, long after either of them strictly needed to be there. Malik mentioned that he worked as an architect for a firm not far from Amara's own office, that he had moved to the city about 3 years earlier, after finishing graduate school, that he enjoyed rock climbing on weekends when the weather allowed. Amara found herself sharing more than she typically did with someone she had just met, mentioning her own work in marketing, her recent decision to pick up painting, even, briefly, her sister Naomi and their close relationship. What struck her most, walking home that evening, was how different the conversation had felt from her interactions with Daniel. Malik had asked questions, and then genuinely listened to her answers, occasionally circling back to something she had mentioned earlier in the conversation, demonstrating that he had actually absorbed what she said, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it felt significant to Amara, who had spent 2 years being the one who listened while rarely being heard in return. She did not think much more about the encounter in the days that followed, assuming it might simply remain a pleasant, one-time interaction. But the following Thursday, arriving at the gym at her usual time, she found Malik already there, and he greeted her with an easy smile that suggested he had, in fact, been hoping to see her again. "I was wondering if you'd show up," he said, and there was something disarming in his honesty, a willingness to admit interest without making it feel like pressure. They fell into conversation again, this time discussing a book Amara had mentioned the previous week, with Malik revealing that he had actually gone out and purchased a copy after their conversation, curious to understand what had captivated her interest so thoroughly. This small gesture, so simple, and yet so unlike anything Daniel had ever done, struck Amara with unexpected force. In 2 years, Daniel had never once followed up on something she mentioned in passing, had never once shown that kind of active curiosity about her inner world. Their conversations continued over the following weeks, developing a rhythm of their own, coffee after workouts on Tuesdays and Thursdays, occasional lunches when their schedules aligned, a growing comfort that built slowly rather than rushing toward anything more. Amara found herself looking forward to these interactions, in a way that felt different from the anxious hope she had carried for 2 years regarding Daniel. This felt lighter, more mutual, less like waiting, and more like discovering. She was careful, still cautious from years of one-sided investment, not wanting to rush into vulnerability with someone new before she had fully processed what she had learned about herself. But Malik seemed to understand this instinctively, never pushing for more than she offered, content to let the connection develop at whatever pace felt natural. Daniel, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of this new presence in Amara's life, though the unease he had begun feeling continued to grow. He noticed, with increasing frequency, that Amara seemed to have plans on evenings that used to be reserved for him. He noticed that her responses to his messages, while always polite, carried a certain briskness that had not existed before. He found himself wondering, in moments he did not fully examine, what exactly had changed, and why the change bothered him more than he expected it to. It was during this period that Daniel's own dating life took an unexpected turn, one that would eventually bring him into direct contact with the consequences of his long-standing blindness toward Amara, though he could not yet see the collision course forming ahead of him. Daniel met a woman named Camila at a friend's birthday gathering, roughly a month after Amara had begun her quiet withdrawal, and something about the timing struck him as almost deliberate, though he could not have explained why he felt that way. Camila worked in finance, sharp and confident, quick with a comeback whenever Daniel tried to tease her, and unlike many of the women he had dated before, she did not seem particularly impressed by him. This, strangely, made her more compelling to him. He found himself putting an effort he rarely had to summon before, texting first, instead of waiting for her to reach out, planning dates with actual thought, rather than defaulting to whatever was convenient. He mentioned Camila to Amara during one of their increasingly rare conversations, watching her reaction carefully, though he could not have said what he was hoping to see. Amara had smiled, genuinely, and told him she hoped it went well. There was no jealousy in her voice, no hint of the quiet ache that would once have colored her response. She simply wished him well and changed the subject to something happening in her own life, mentioning, briefly, that she had started attending a painting class. Daniel found himself oddly deflated by her easy acceptance, though he did not examine the feeling closely at the time. Some part of him, buried beneath layers of habit and assumption, had perhaps expected a different reaction, some flicker of the old attentiveness he had always taken for granted. Its absence left him unsettled in a way he could not name. Over the following weeks, as Daniel's relationship with Camila developed, Amara's own life continued to expand, in directions that had nothing to do with him. Her painting class had introduced her to a small community of people who shared her interest, including Grace, who had become something of an unofficial mentor during this period of transformation. They met for coffee outside of class occasionally, and Grace continued to offer the kind of blunt, caring perspective that Amara had come to value deeply. "How are things with the architect?" Grace asked one afternoon, stirring sugar into her coffee with unhurried precision. Amara felt a small smile tug at her lips before she could stop it. "Good. Really good, actually. We're taking it slow, but it feels different. Easier." "Easier how?" Amara considered the question seriously before answering. "I don't have to work so hard to be noticed. He just notices things, on his own, without me having to point them out, or hint at them, or hope really hard that he'll figure it out eventually." Grace nodded, satisfied. "That's what it's supposed to feel like. Not exhausting. You've spent 2 years thinking love meant constant effort on your part alone. It's supposed to be effort on both sides, moving together, not you pushing a boulder up a hill by yourself, while someone else just enjoys the view." The metaphor stayed with Amara long after the conversation ended, resurfacing at unexpected moments as she continued navigating her growing connection with Malik. Their relationship had progressed from coffee after workouts to actual dates, dinner at a small Italian restaurant near his apartment, a Saturday afternoon spent walking through an art museum, where he pointed out architectural details in paintings that most people would have overlooked entirely, revealing a mind that saw structure and beauty in equal measure. There was a particular evening, roughly 6 weeks after their first meeting at the gym, when Malik invited her to see a building he had designed, still under construction on the outskirts of the city. They had walked through the unfinished space together as the sun set, Malik explaining his design choices with quiet passion, describing how he had wanted the building to capture natural light in a way that would make even gray winter days feel warm inside. Amara had listened, genuinely fascinated, asking questions that clearly pleased him, and at some point during that walk, standing in a half-finished room with exposed beams overhead, Malik had turned to her and said, simply, "I like showing you things. I don't know why, but it matters to me that you understand what I'm trying to do here." The words had struck Amara with unexpected force, not because they were particularly grand or romantic, but because they represented something she had waited 2 years to hear from someone else and had never received. A simple acknowledgement that her understanding, her presence, her attention, mattered to him in return. She had not said anything dramatic in response, simply smiling and telling him the building was beautiful, that she could see exactly what he meant about the light. But something had settled between them in that moment, a quiet recognition of mutual investment that neither of them needed to name aloud. Their relationship continued to deepen over the following weeks, moving at a pace that felt natural rather than rushed. Malik met Naomi over a casual dinner, and Amara watched with quiet satisfaction as her sister, typically reserved with new people, warmed to him almost immediately, later telling Amara over the phone that he seemed like someone who actually paid attention, unlike certain other people she could name but chose not to. Meanwhile, Daniel's relationship with Camila hit its first real obstacle when she was offered a temporary work assignment in another city, requiring her to relocate for 3 months. The distance introduced strain that their relatively new relationship struggled to accommodate, and Daniel found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, without his usual outlet for processing romantic difficulty. He picked up his phone one evening, out of habit, intending to call Amara the way he always had during moments of relationship turbulence. He got as far as opening her contact information before pausing, staring at her name on the screen, suddenly uncertain whether calling her was still something he was allowed to do so casually. He set the phone down without calling, an unfamiliar feeling settling over him, something between loneliness and confusion. He tried calling a different friend instead, Ethan, the coworker who had questioned him weeks earlier about the imbalance in his friendship with Amara. Ethan listened patiently as Daniel described the strain with Camila, but at some point during the conversation, he asked a question that caught Daniel off guard entirely. "Have you talked to Amara about any of this?" Daniel paused, genuinely surprised by his own hesitation. "No, I don't know. It feels different now, calling her about this stuff." Different how? Daniel struggled to articulate the shift, something he had felt building for weeks, but had not yet examined directly. "I don't know. She seems different lately. Busier. Like she's got her own life going on, that doesn't really include me the way it used to." Ethan was quiet for a moment, before responding, his voice carrying a gentleness that suggested he had been waiting for this realization for some time. "Maybe that's because she does have her own life now. Maybe she always did, and you just never noticed, because she made it so easy to focus on yours instead." The words landed with unexpected weight, echoing something Daniel could not fully articulate, but recognized as true on some deeper level. He ended the call shortly afterward, sitting alone in his apartment, turning the conversation over in his mind, uncomfortable with the direction his thoughts kept drifting. He found himself, over the following days, paying closer attention to his memories of Amara, revisiting moments he had never examined closely before. He remembered the rooftop evening when he had talked at length about Priya, while Amara listened, and something in his memory now registered an expression on her face that he had not properly noticed at the time, a flicker of something he could only now, with the benefit of distance, identify as pain carefully concealed. He remembered his sister's wedding, Amara sitting alone at their table while he danced with other women, and the memory now carried a discomfort it had never carried before, a dawning awareness of how it must have felt to be present, but overlooked in that particular way. These realizations arrived slowly, piece by piece, refusing to assemble themselves into any complete picture all at once. Daniel was not yet ready to understand the full shape of what he had missed over 2 years, but something inside him had begun, almost against his will, to question assumptions he had never previously thought to examine. It was during this period of quiet, uncomfortable self-reflection that Priya, the mutual friend who had once briefly dated Daniel, decided to organize a small dinner celebrating her recent promotion at work, inviting a mix of people from their shared professional circle, without fully considering who might end up seated at the same table. She sent the invitation to Daniel, who had recently reconnected with Camila after her return from her temporary assignment, and separately to Amara, who mentioned the invitation to Malik almost as an afterthought, asking if he would like to accompany her to what she expected would be a fairly ordinary evening among old colleagues. Neither Daniel nor Amara gave the guest list much thought in the days leading up to the dinner. Neither of them could have anticipated how significantly that evening would alter the quiet, separate trajectories their lives had been following for the past 2 months. The evening of the dinner began with Amara standing in front of her closet for longer than she typically allowed herself, holding up first one dress and then another, before finally settling on a deep green one that Naomi had helped her pick out weeks earlier for an occasion that had not yet arrived. She did not consciously think about Daniel while getting ready, though some quiet part of her mind must have registered that he would likely be there, given the shared history among the group Priya had invited. She applied her makeup carefully, styled her hair loose around her shoulders, and by the time Malik arrived to pick her up, she felt genuinely good, not anxious in the way she once might have felt before an evening involving Daniel, but simply confident in herself, and pleased to be spending the evening with someone who made her feel valued. Malik complimented her the moment he saw her, a warmth in his eyes that felt entirely uncomplicated, and they made easy conversation during the drive to the restaurant, discussing a project he was finishing at work, and a painting Amara had been struggling to complete for her class. Across the city, Daniel was having a considerably more complicated evening. He had invited Camila to accompany him to the dinner, eager to introduce her to his wider circle, now that they had worked through the strain of her temporary relocation. But something had felt off between them throughout the drive, a tension neither of them addressed directly, stemming perhaps from unresolved questions about their long-term compatibility that the distance had surfaced but not resolved. He tried to push these concerns aside as they entered the restaurant, greeting Priya warmly, congratulating her on the promotion, settling into easy conversation with people he had not seen in months. He did not immediately notice Amara's arrival, seated as he was with his back partially toward the entrance, engaged in conversation with Ethan about a project at work. It was Camila who noticed first, leaning close to whisper that a woman in green had just walked in looking absolutely stunning, and something in her tone suggested she was simply making conversation rather than expressing any particular concern. Daniel turned, following her gaze, and felt something shift violently in his chest the moment he recognized Amara. She looked different somehow, though he could not immediately articulate how. Perhaps it was simply that he had not seen her dressed for an evening out in several weeks, accustomed instead to the more casual version of her he remembered from countless nights spent on her couch or his. Perhaps it was the confidence in her posture, the ease with which she laughed at something the man beside her said, a laugh that reached her eyes in a way Daniel could not remember ever witnessing, directed at anything he himself had said. The man beside her, tall with an easy, grounded presence, kept his hand resting lightly at the small of her back as they were shown to their seats, a small gesture that somehow conveyed more intimacy than anything overt could have. Daniel watched them settle into chairs, near the far end of the long table Priya had arranged, watched Amara laugh again at something the man murmured close to her ear, and felt a hollow, unfamiliar ache begin spreading through his chest. He tried to return his attention to his own conversation, to Camila beside him, to Ethan discussing work matters that suddenly seemed impossibly unimportant. But his eyes kept drifting back down the table, tracking Amara's movements, the easy way she reached for her wine glass, the genuine warmth in her expression as she spoke with the man beside her. Camila noticed his distraction eventually, following his gaze with growing curiosity. "You know her?" she asked, not accusingly, simply curious. "Yeah," Daniel said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "We used to work together. We're friends." Camila studied him for a moment longer than the explanation warranted, but said nothing further, returning her attention to the conversation happening around them. Daniel, meanwhile, found himself unable to fully engage with anything happening at his own end of the table. His attention repeatedly pulled toward the sound of Amara's laughter, toward the easy, unguarded happiness radiating from her in a way he had genuinely never witnessed before. Dinner progressed through several courses, conversation flowing easily around shared memories of their old workplace, updates on various colleagues who had moved on to other companies, the usual rhythms of a reunion among people who had once spent significant time together. Daniel participated where necessary, offering appropriate responses at appropriate moments, but a significant portion of his attention remained fixed on the far end of the table, watching Amara in a way he had never allowed himself to before. He noticed things he had somehow never registered clearly across 2 years of friendship. He noticed the particular way she tilted her head when genuinely interested in what someone was saying, a gesture he now realized she had directed at him countless times without his ever truly appreciating it. He noticed how her hands moved when she spoke, expressive and animated, alive with an energy he had perhaps taken for granted, as simply part of the background of his own life, rather than something remarkable in its own right. Most significantly, he noticed the man beside her, Malik, and the particular quality of attention he directed toward Amara throughout the meal. It was not performative or excessive, nothing designed to draw attention to itself. It was simply present, consistent, a steady focus that seemed to take genuine pleasure in her company, rather than merely tolerating it. At one point, Amara reached for the breadbasket at the same moment Malik did, and their hands brushed together, prompting a small, private smile between them that had nothing to do with anyone else at the table. Daniel watched this small exchange and felt something inside him crack slightly, a recognition arriving with uncomfortable clarity. He had spent 2 years receiving Amara's attention and warmth without ever once looking at her, the way this stranger now looked at her, as though she were the most interesting person in the entire restaurant. The moment that finally broke through Daniel's carefully maintained composure came when Amara laughed at something Malik said. A full, unguarded laugh that turned several heads at nearby tables, her whole face transformed by genuine delight. Daniel felt his chest tighten uncomfortably, an emotion he did not immediately want to name rising up through layers of denial and habit. He rose from his seat without fully deciding to, muttering something to Camila about needing water, though there was already a full glass sitting untouched in front of him. He walked toward the far end of the table with no clear plan, drawn forward by something he could not fully control. Some need to close the distance between himself and a realization he had been avoiding for weeks. It was in this moment, as Daniel approached, that Amara's hand slipped on her wine glass, the sudden weight of his approaching presence registering in her peripheral vision, before her conscious mind fully processed it, sending the glass tumbling from her fingers and shattering against the edge of her plate. red wine spreading rapidly across the white tablecloth. The small commotion drew attention from nearby tables, several people rising to help clean up the spill, Malik immediately reaching for a napkin to blot at Amara's wrist where a few drops had landed. Amara herself remained still for a moment, her eyes locked with Daniel's across the short distance now separating them, something unspoken passing between them that neither could have easily articulated. "Amara?" Daniel said, his voice catching on her name in a way that surprised even himself. She turned fully to face him then, and for a brief moment, something old and familiar flickered behind her eyes, a residue of 2 years spent hoping he might one day look at her exactly the way he was looking at her now. But the flicker passed quickly, replaced by something steadier, something rooted in the growth she had cultivated so carefully over the past 2 months. "Daniel," she said, her voice calm and even. "It's been a while." Daniel stood there for a long moment, aware of the small crowd of attention gathered around the spilled wine, aware of Camila watching from their table, with an expression he could not quite read, aware most of all of Amara's steady, unbothered gaze meeting his own, without the anxious searching he had grown so accustomed to over 2 years. "You look well," he managed finally, the words feeling inadequate to everything churning beneath the surface of his composure. "I am well," Amara replied, and there was no performance in the statement, no attempt to make him feel a particular way. It was simply true, spoken with the quiet confidence of someone who had genuinely arrived at a good place in her life. Malik extended a hand toward Daniel, introducing himself with easy politeness, apparently sensing no threat in the encounter, simply treating it as a normal social introduction between people who shared a mutual acquaintance. Daniel shook his hand automatically, murmuring some appropriate greeting, while internally registering the calm, grounded confidence radiating from this man who had somehow, in a matter of months, earned a place in Amara's life that Daniel himself had never managed to occupy across 2 full years. "It was good seeing you," Amara said after a moment, the words carrying gentle finality, a clear signal that the interaction had reached its natural conclusion, without any need for further extension. Daniel nodded, aware that lingering any longer would only make the moment more awkward, and returned to his own table, where Camila was watching him with an expression that had shifted from mild curiosity to something more searching. "Old friend?" she asked, once he had settled back into his seat. "Something like that," Daniel said, unable to fully explain, even to himself, what exactly Amara represented in his history, let alone articulate it clearly to Camila. The rest of the dinner passed in a haze for Daniel, conversation continuing around him, while his attention remained fractured, repeatedly drawn back toward the sound of Amara's voice, the occasional glimpse of her laughing at something Malik said, the easy comfort radiating from that end of the table. He barely tasted the dessert course, responded to questions with delayed, distracted answers, and felt an overwhelming relief when the evening finally began winding down and people started gathering their coats. He found himself lingering near the coat check, ostensibly waiting for Camila to finish a conversation with Priya, but really positioning himself for one more glimpse of Amara before the evening ended entirely. She emerged from the dining room, with Malik's hand resting lightly against her lower back, laughing at something he had said, radiant, in a way that struck Daniel with fresh, uncomfortable force. She caught his eye briefly as she passed, offering a small, polite smile, nothing more, before continuing toward the exit with Malik beside her. Daniel watched them go, watched the easy way they moved together, the natural rhythm of 2 people comfortable in each other's presence, and felt something settle heavily in his chest, a recognition he could no longer push aside or explain away. He drove Camila home in near silence that night, offering only brief, distracted responses to her attempts at conversation. She noticed his preoccupation, but chose not to press the issue directly, though her expression suggested she understood, on some level, that something significant had shifted during that dinner, something that had little to do with her. Alone in his apartment later that night, Daniel found himself unable to sleep, his mind circling back repeatedly to images from the evening, Amara's laugh, the easy way Malik's hand had found the small of her back, the steady, unbothered look in her eyes when she had said, "I am well," without any need for his validation or reassurance. He got up eventually and poured himself a glass of water, standing at his kitchen window looking out over the quiet street below, turning over 2 years of memories with a clarity he had never previously allowed himself. He thought about the rooftop conversation, about Amara's careful, patient listening while he described his feelings for Priya. He thought about his sister's wedding, about Amara sitting alone while he danced with other women, smiling, through what he now recognized, with sickening clarity, as genuine hurt she had never once expressed aloud. He thought about every late-night phone call he had made to her over 2 years, every time he had shown up at her apartment needing comfort, every small kindness she had extended, without ever once asking anything in return. And he thought, with growing discomfort, about how easily he had accepted all of it, how naturally he had assumed her presence and generosity as simply part of the landscape of his life, never once pausing to consider what it cost her, or what she might have wanted in return. The realization that finally crystallized, sometime past midnight, as he stood alone in his darkened kitchen, was not simply that he had lost something valuable through his own inattention. It was more specific and more uncomfortable than that. He realized, with a clarity that felt almost physically painful, that Amara had been offering him exactly what he claimed to want from every relationship he had pursued over the past 2 years. Someone attentive, someone caring, someone who genuinely saw him and made an effort to understand him. And he had overlooked all of it entirely, distracted by women who demanded his attention through drama and complication, never recognizing the quieter, steadier form of care that had been available to him the entire time. He did not sleep well that night, and the following days brought no relief from the discomfort that had settled over him. He found himself distracted at work, unable to focus on projects that would normally have held his interest easily. He noticed, with a kind of bitter irony, that Ethan's earlier observations now made complete sense to him, arriving far too late to change anything meaningful. He considered, several times over the following week, reaching out to Amara directly, attempting to explain what he had realized, perhaps even asking for some kind of chance to make things right. But each time he picked up his phone, he found himself uncertain what exactly he would say, uncertain whether 2 years of accumulated blindness could be addressed through any single conversation, uncertain, most uncomfortably, whether his sudden interest was rooted in genuine feeling, or simply wounded pride at watching someone he had taken for granted find happiness with someone else. This last question troubled him more than he wanted to admit. He turned it over repeatedly during quiet moments, trying to honestly assess his own motivations. Did he actually love Amara, in the way that mattered, the way that would have prompted him to notice her sooner if his feelings were genuine? Or was he simply reacting to the discomfort of watching something he had assumed would always be available suddenly slip beyond his reach? He did not arrive at a clear answer during that first week, though the question continued to gnaw at him persistently, refusing to be set aside or ignored. Meanwhile, his relationship with Camila, already strained from the earlier separation, began deteriorating further under the weight of his obvious distraction. She confronted him directly about 10 days after the dinner, asking bluntly whether his attention had been fully present in their relationship, or whether some part of him remained fixated elsewhere. Daniel, to his credit, did not lie to her. He admitted, haltingly, that seeing Amara at the dinner had stirred up feelings and realizations he was still trying to process, though he insisted, perhaps more to convince himself than her, that he was not entirely certain what those feelings meant. Camila listened to this admission with a composure that suggested she had already anticipated it, and ultimately decided that continuing their relationship while he remained so clearly unresolved would not serve either of them well. Their breakup, when it came, was quiet and without significant conflict, both of them recognizing that whatever had existed between them had never been given a fair chance to develop, while Daniel's attention remained divided. Freed from his relationship with Camila, though not particularly relieved by the ending, Daniel found himself with even more unstructured time in which to sit with his growing understanding of what he had lost. He began, in the weeks that followed, a kind of quiet reckoning that extended beyond simply missing Amara's presence in his life. He started paying closer attention to his own patterns, noticing, with increasing discomfort, how often he had positioned himself as the center of his relationships, expecting attention and care without reciprocating in equal measure. He thought back through his history with Sophia, with Elena, with Priya, with Camila, recognizing a similar thread running through each relationship, a tendency to receive far more than he gave, to notice problems only when they directly inconvenienced him, rather than out of genuine attentiveness to his partner's needs. This pattern of self-examination was uncomfortable, and Daniel found himself wanting to escape it more than once. distracting himself with work projects or evenings out with Ethan and other friends. But something had shifted permanently in his awareness since that dinner. Some door that had been opened and could not easily be closed again. He reached out to Ethan directly one evening, admitting more openly than he had before that he believed he had genuinely mishandled his friendship with Amara, that he wanted to understand how he could have been so blind to something that now, in retrospect, seemed almost impossible to have missed. Ethan, who had watched this dynamic unfold from a slight distance for over a year, offered his perspective carefully, without cruelty, but also without softening the truth unnecessarily. You never had to work for her attention, so you never learned to value it properly. Some people take without realizing they're taking, especially when the person giving never asks for anything back. It doesn't make you a terrible person, Daniel, but it doesn't excuse it either. You had 2 years to notice, and you didn't. Not until someone else did first. The words stung, but Daniel found himself unable to argue with their essential truth. He asked, somewhat tentatively, whether Ethan thought there was any chance of things being different now, if he approached Amara honestly about what he had come to understand. Ethan's response was measured, careful not to offer false hope, but also not entirely dismissive of the possibility. That's not really up to you to decide anymore. She spent 2 years hoping you'd notice her. She's finally built something for herself where someone does notice her, consistently, without her having to fight for it. If you go to her now, you need to understand that whatever you say, it's her choice entirely what happens next. You don't get to just show up and expect her to drop what she's built because you finally woke up. This conversation stayed with Daniel for several days, shaping how he eventually decided to approach the situation. He resisted the urge to text Amara immediately, recognizing that any communication driven by impulsive emotion would likely do more harm than good. Instead, he spent time genuinely reflecting on what he wanted to say, and more importantly, what he wanted to acknowledge about his own behavior over the previous 2 years. He drafted several messages over the following week, deleting each one before sending, aware that written words could not adequately capture the complexity of what he needed to express. Eventually, he decided that a text message would be an appropriate first step, not to demand anything from Amara, but simply to acknowledge what he had come to understand, leaving the door open for whatever response, or lack of response, she chose to offer. The message he finally sent, nearly 3 weeks after the dinner, read simply, "I've been thinking a lot about the last 2 years, and I owe you an honest conversation, if you're willing. No pressure at all. I just wanted you to know I finally see what I should have seen a long time ago." He sent the message late on a Thursday evening, and then spent an uncomfortable, restless few hours waiting for any response, checking his phone repeatedly, despite telling himself he would not do so. Amara did not respond that night, and Daniel forced himself to accept that her silence was entirely her right, that he had no claim to an immediate answer, or any answer at all, given how he had handled the 2 years that preceded this moment. Amara, meanwhile, received the message while sitting on her couch with Malik, watching a movie neither of them was paying particularly close attention to. She read it twice, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions rise up within her, some combination of validation, old hurt, and a curious, distant kind of sympathy for the confusion Daniel must be experiencing. She did not respond immediately, choosing instead to sit with the message for several days, wanting to be certain that whatever reply she eventually sent came from a place of genuine clarity rather than reactive emotion. She mentioned the message to Malik that same evening, showing him the text without hesitation, appreciating that their relationship had reached a point of trust where she did not feel the need to hide such things from him. Malik read the message carefully, then handed the phone back to her, without visible concern or jealousy. "How do you feel about it?" he asked simply, his tone genuinely curious rather than anxious. Amara considered the question honestly before answering. "Strange. 2 years ago, this message would have meant everything to me. I would have read it 100 times, analyzed every word, convinced myself it meant he finally loved me the way I wanted him to. Now it just feels like information. Something that happened, not something that changes anything about where I am now." Malik nodded, seemingly satisfied by this answer, though he added gently, "You don't owe him anything, you know, not a conversation, not closure, not forgiveness. Whatever you decide to do with that message, it should be entirely for your own peace, not because he's finally asking." This perspective settled something in Amara, giving her permission to approach the situation entirely on her own terms, rather than feeling obligated to respond in any particular way, simply because Daniel had finally reached out. She spent the following days continuing her normal routine, attending her painting class, spending time with Malik, checking in with Naomi, allowing the question of how to respond to Daniel's message to settle naturally, rather than forcing an answer before she was ready. Naomi, when told about the message during one of their regular phone calls, had a characteristically direct reaction. Of course he finally noticed now that someone else does. That's not love, Amara, that's competition. Be careful not to mistake his sudden interest for something more meaningful than it actually is. Amara appreciated her sister's perspective, though she found herself, upon reflection, believing that Daniel's realization, however delayed, might carry some genuine substance beyond simple competitive instinct. She had known him for 2 years, had witnessed enough of his character to believe he was not entirely shallow or reactive, even if he had been remarkably blind regarding her own feelings. But she also recognized the wisdom in Naomi's caution, understanding that whatever Daniel had come to realize, it did not obligate her to reopen a door she had worked so hard to close. After nearly a week of consideration, Amara finally decided to respond to Daniel's message, not to reject him outright, nor to offer any false hope, but simply to acknowledge his message honestly and set clear terms for whatever conversation might follow. She wrote back carefully, choosing her words with more deliberation than she had ever applied to any message directed at him during their 2 years of friendship. I appreciate you saying that. It means something, even now. I'm willing to talk, but I need you to understand going into it that I'm not the same person who spent 2 years hoping you'd notice me. Whatever this conversation is, it needs to be honest, and it needs to respect where I am now, not where I used to be. She sent the message and set her phone aside, feeling a quiet, steady confidence in having responded from a place of genuine self-respect, rather than old habit or hope. Daniel's reply came quickly, grateful and careful, suggesting they meet at a neutral location, a small park near both their neighborhoods, rather than anywhere carrying the weight of their shared history. They agreed to meet the following Saturday afternoon, and as the day approached, both of them found themselves preparing for the conversation in very different ways. Daniel rehearsing what he wanted to say, trying to find words adequate to the magnitude of what he had come to understand, and Amara simply reminding herself, repeatedly, that whatever happened during that conversation, she had already built a life worth protecting, regardless of what Daniel ultimately said, or how the conversation unfolded. Saturday arrived clear and mild, the kind of early autumn afternoon that made the small park near Amara's neighborhood particularly pleasant, the trees just beginning to turn amber and gold along the walking path where she and Daniel had agreed to meet. Amara arrived a few minutes early, choosing a bench near the entrance rather than walking further into the park, wanting to keep the meeting contained rather than allowing it to sprawl into something more extended than she intended. She wore simple clothes, comfortable rather than dressed to impress, a deliberate choice meant to signal, even if only to herself, that this conversation was not about performing for Daniel's benefit. Daniel arrived exactly on time, which surprised her slightly, given his historical tendency toward casual lateness during their years of friendship. He looked nervous, in a way she had rarely seen from him, his usual easy confidence noticeably absent as he approached the bench where she sat waiting. "Thank you for agreeing to this," he said, settling onto the opposite end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. "Of course," Amara replied, keeping her voice even and calm. "You said you had something you wanted to talk about." Daniel took a long breath before beginning, and when he spoke, his words carried a rawness that Amara had not expected, a vulnerability quite different from the easy charm she had grown accustomed to over 2 years of friendship. "I've spent the last few weeks trying to understand how I could have known you for 2 years, and never once really seen you," he said. "Not the way I should have. I keep going back through memories, trying to figure out when exactly I decided it was okay to just take everything you gave me, without ever asking what you needed in return. And I can't find a single moment where I consciously made that decision. It just happened, gradually, because you never made me work for anything, and I never thought to ask why that was." Amara listened without interrupting, feeling a complicated mixture of validation and old, familiar ache rising within her as he spoke. memories of 2 years of quiet hope surfacing alongside the calm clarity she had cultivated since. "I'm not saying this to ask you to come back to how things were," Daniel continued, his voice steadier now. "I understand that's not fair to ask, and honestly, I'm not even sure that's what I want, or what I'm allowed to want. I think I mostly needed you to know that I finally understand what I overlooked. That you loved me, probably, for a long time, and I never once gave you a reason to believe I saw it, let alone returned it." The word loved hung in the air between them, the first time either of them had spoken the truth of Amara's feelings so directly and openly. She felt her throat tighten slightly, old emotion rising unexpectedly even now, months removed from the height of her devotion to him. "Yes," she said simply, deciding that honesty, at this point, served her better than continued avoidance. "I did love you. For 2 years. And you're right, you never saw it, because I never let you see it directly, and because you never really looked closely enough to notice on your own." Daniel absorbed this confirmation with visible difficulty, his jaw tightening slightly, his eyes dropping to his hands resting in his lap. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know that doesn't undo anything. But I am sorry. For all of it. For every time you drove me home after a breakup with someone else. For the wedding. For every late-night call where I never once asked how you were actually doing underneath everything." Amara felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, though she willed them back, unwilling to let this conversation collapse into something purely emotional, without also addressing the clarity she had worked so hard to achieve. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "It matters more than you probably realize, hearing you actually acknowledge it instead of just moving forward like none of it happened." "Is there any chance?" Daniel began, then stopped himself, seeming to reconsider whether the question was fair to ask at all. He tried again, choosing his words more carefully. "I'm not asking you to leave him, or to give up what you've built. I know that's not something I have any right to ask. I guess I just want to know if there's any part of you that still wonders what might have happened if I'd figured this out sooner." Amara considered the question honestly, understanding that Daniel deserved a truthful answer, rather than a comfortable deflection. "Of course there's a part of me that wonders," she admitted. "For 2 years, that wondering was basically my whole life. But wondering isn't the same as wanting to go back, Daniel. I spent 2 years hoping you'd wake up to something you never even seemed to notice was there, and now that you have, finally, it doesn't erase everything I learned about myself in the process of moving on without you." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "I built something for myself these past months that has nothing to do with waiting for you anymore. I learned that I don't have to make myself smaller or more convenient to be loved properly. Malik didn't need 2 years and a wine glass shattering across a table to notice me. He noticed from the very beginning, without me having to prove anything, or wait for some breaking point to force his attention." Daniel absorbed this with visible pain, though he did not argue or attempt to diminish what she was saying. "That's fair," he said quietly. "More than fair, honestly. I think some part of me knew, even before I texted you, that this conversation probably wasn't going to end, with you choosing to come back to something that clearly caused you 2 years of pain. I don't think it would be healthy for either of us if it did," Amara said gently, softening her tone slightly, recognizing that despite everything, some genuine affection for Daniel remained, simply reshaped into something calmer and more distant than it once had been. "You needed to lose something you took for granted, to actually see it clearly. And I needed those 2 years, painful as they were, to finally learn what I deserve from someone who actually pays attention. I don't think either of us would be better off pretending none of that happened." They sat together for a while longer, the conversation shifting into calmer territory, Daniel asking, with genuine curiosity rather than jealousy, about Malik, about the life Amara had built for herself over the past months. She answered honestly, describing her painting class, her renewed friendships with old college friends, the quiet confidence she had discovered in herself along the way. Before they parted, Daniel said one final thing that stayed with Amara long after their conversation ended. "I hope, whatever happens next for both of us, that I actually learn something from this, not just regret losing you, but actually change how I show up for people going forward. You deserved better than what I gave you for 2 years, and I don't want to just feel sorry about that, without doing something differently because of it." Amara nodded, appreciating the sincerity in his words, even as she recognized that whether he truly followed through on that intention remained to be seen, something only time would reveal. "I hope so too," she said simply. "For whoever comes next in your life, if nothing else." They said goodbye without any dramatic gestures, no lingering embraces or unresolved tension, simply two people who had shared 2 significant years, acknowledging honestly what those years had meant and what they no longer meant going forward. Amara walked home from the park feeling lighter than she had expected, a weight she had not fully realized she was still carrying, finally settling into something resembling genuine peace. That evening, Amara sat with Malik on his balcony, the city stretching out below them in the fading autumn light, and told him everything that had happened during her conversation with Daniel, holding nothing back, wanting their relationship to remain built on the same foundation of honesty and openness that had drawn her to him in the first place. Malik listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions rather than reacting defensively, and when she finished, he simply reached for her hand and asked how she was feeling now that the conversation had actually happened. "Relieved," Amara said, surprising herself slightly with how true the word felt. "I think I needed to hear him actually acknowledge everything, out loud, in order to fully let it go. It's strange, but hearing him say he was sorry, really sorry, and understanding that he finally saw what he missed, it didn't make me want to go back. It just made the last 2 years feel complete somehow, like a chapter that finally got its proper ending, instead of just fading out unfinished." Malik nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "I'm glad you got that closure, and I'm glad you didn't need it to feel sure about us. I never wanted you to choose me just because he woke up too late. I wanted you to choose me because it's actually what you want, independent of anything he does or doesn't do. You've shown me, every single day since we met, exactly how it feels to be with someone who doesn't need a crisis to notice me. I don't have that same uncertainty with you that I carried for 2 years with him. I don't wonder if you see me. I already know you do, because you show me constantly, without me ever having to ask." They sat together quietly for a while after that, watching the sky deepen into evening, and Amara felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, a sense of complete alignment between where she was and where she wanted to be. There was no lingering ache pulling her attention toward what might have been, no quiet hope that circumstances might someday shift in a different direction. There was simply the present moment, solid and real, built on choices she had made deliberately, rather than habits she had fallen into by default. Over the following weeks, Amara's life continued to expand in directions entirely independent of her history with Daniel. Her painting improved steadily under Grace's encouraging mentorship, culminating in a small group exhibition at a local community center where several of her pieces were displayed, alongside work from her classmates. Malik attended the opening, standing proudly beside her paintings, introducing her to colleagues from his own firm who had come to support him, weaving her fully into the fabric of his own social world, in a way that felt natural rather than performative. Naomi attended as well, studying Amara's paintings with genuine pride, later telling her privately that she had never seen her sister look so settled, so entirely herself, in longer than she could remember. "You used to shrink yourself down to fit into whatever space Daniel left for you," Naomi observed, standing before one particular painting, depicting a sunrise breaking over unfamiliar hills. "Now you're just taking up your own space, full size, without asking permission from anyone." Amara found herself smiling at this observation, recognizing its truth without needing to defend or explain herself further. She had spent 2 years making herself convenient, agreeable, endlessly patient, believing that this was the price of eventually being loved properly. She understood now, with hard-won clarity, that genuine love did not require that kind of constant self-diminishment. It simply required finding someone willing to meet her fully, without demanding she make herself smaller to fit into whatever space they were willing to offer. Daniel, for his part, seemed to genuinely absorb the lessons from their park bench conversation, at least based on updates Amara occasionally received through mutual acquaintances like Ethan and Priya. He began dating more intentionally, according to these secondhand reports, showing up more consistently, asking questions rather than simply expecting attention, making efforts that had been notably absent during his relationships throughout the 2 years Amara had known him. She did not follow his progress closely, no longer invested in tracking his growth or measuring her own worth against whatever changes he did or did not make. But she found herself genuinely hoping, when updates reached her occasionally, that he had truly learned something lasting from the pain of losing what he had overlooked for so long. Not because she needed validation from his growth, but simply because she no longer harbored any resentment substantial enough to wish him continued unhappiness. Roughly 6 months after that dinner, where the wine glass had shattered across the white tablecloth, Malik asked Amara to move in with him, a decision they discussed carefully and thoroughly, before agreeing that their relationship had reached a point of genuine readiness for that next step. She remembered, packing boxes in her old apartment, finding an old photograph from Daniel's sister's wedding tucked into a drawer, herself smiling in her green dress, while Daniel danced in the background with someone else entirely. She looked at the photograph for a long moment, feeling something distant and almost tender toward the woman in that image. A woman who had believed so deeply that patience alone could eventually earn her the love she deserved. She did not feel anger toward that version of herself, nor excessive pity. She simply recognized her as someone who had needed to learn a difficult lesson before arriving at the peace she now carried, and she tucked the photograph carefully into a box of old memories, neither discarding it entirely nor allowing it to occupy any prominent place in the new life she was building. Moving into Malik's apartment felt entirely different from the years she had spent orbiting Daniel's life, adjusting her own schedule and priorities around his needs, while quietly hoping for reciprocation that never arrived. This felt like building something together, deliberately and mutually, two people choosing each other daily, rather than one person hoping to eventually be chosen. A year after the dinner that had changed the course of her life so completely, Amara stood in the same small park where she and Daniel had once sat on a bench, acknowledging the end of one chapter, though this time, she was there for an entirely different reason, walking hand in hand with Malik on a quiet Sunday morning, discussing plans for a small garden they hoped to plant together on the balcony of their apartment. She thought, occasionally, about the woman she had been during those 2 years of quiet devotion, and she felt genuine compassion for her rather than embarrassment or regret. That version of herself had not been foolish or weak, simply someone who had not yet learned that love, freely given, without any reciprocal effort, tends to be received as obligation rather than gift. She had needed to learn, through difficult experience, that her worth was not measured by how much she could offer someone who never had to work to keep her, but by whether she could find someone willing to meet her fully, matching her effort with his own. Grace, still a close friend and occasional painting companion, once asked Amara during one of their coffee outings whether she ever regretted the 2 years spent hoping for Daniel's attention, whether she wished she had recognized the imbalance sooner and saved herself the pain of waiting so long. Amara considered the question seriously before answering, understanding that her response carried real weight, a genuine reflection on everything she had learned. "I don't think I'd change it, actually," she said. "Those 2 years taught me exactly what I don't want, which made it so much easier to recognize what I do want when Malik showed up. If I hadn't lived through the exhaustion of constantly giving without receiving, I might not have known how remarkable it felt when someone finally met me halfway without me having to ask." Grace nodded thoughtfully, stirring her coffee slowly. "Some lessons only stick when we've lived the alternative long enough to feel the difference clearly." "Exactly," Amara agreed. "I don't wish those years away. I just made sure they became the foundation for something better, instead of letting them convince me I wasn't worth more than what he was willing to give." Naomi, too, occasionally reflected on her sister's journey during their regular phone calls, expressing quiet pride in how completely Amara had transformed her understanding of her own worth. "You used to call me describing every small thing Daniel did, hoping I'd tell you it meant something significant," Naomi observed one evening. "Now you barely mention him at all, and when you do, it's just as a distant, settled memory. That's real growth, Amara. Not bitterness, not lingering hurt, just genuine peace." Amara agreed, recognizing the truth in her sister's observation. She had moved beyond simply healing from what Daniel had failed to give her. She had built, deliberately and with full intention, a life defined by mutual respect and genuine partnership. A life where she never again had to wonder whether her presence was valued or whether her feelings mattered enough to warrant reciprocal effort. Her relationship with Malik continued to deepen steadily over the following months, built on the same foundation of attentiveness and mutual investment that had characterized it from the very beginning. He continued to notice things about her without needing prompting, continued to show up consistently in ways both large and small, continued to make her feel, every single day, that her presence in his life was something he valued, rather than something he simply expected. There came an evening, nearly 18 months after their first meeting at the gym, when Malik knelt down in the same unfinished building where he had first shown her his architectural work, now fully completed and occupied, the natural light he had designed pouring warmly through the windows exactly as he had envisioned. He asked her to marry him, and Amara said yes without a single moment of hesitation, without the anxious uncertainty that had characterized every hopeful moment she had once spent waiting for Daniel to notice her. This was different, she realized, standing in that beautiful, light-filled room, with tears of genuine joy in her eyes. This was not hope built on patience and waiting. This was certainty, built on 2 years of mutual effort, of being seen and valued exactly as she was, without needing to diminish herself or wait indefinitely for someone else to finally wake up to her worth. Looking back on everything that had unfolded since that night, the wine glass shattered across the white tablecloth, Amara understood clearly what the entire experience had ultimately taught her. Love, real love, was never meant to be a one-sided offering, given endlessly in hope of eventual reciprocation. It was meant to be mutual, built through consistent effort from both people involved, each person choosing the other, actively and repeatedly, rather than one person simply hoping to eventually be chosen. She had spent 2 years believing that patience and devotion alone would eventually earn her the love she deserved from Daniel. She learned, through painful but ultimately valuable experience, that some people will only ever value what costs them effort to keep, and that the answer to being overlooked was never to give more, wait longer, or make herself smaller and more convenient. The answer was to walk toward her own worth directly, building a life so full and complete on her own terms that anyone who wished to be part of it would need to show up fully, matching her effort, rather than simply receiving it. In the end, Daniel's realization, arriving as it did 2 years too late, changed nothing about the path Amara had already chosen for herself. It served, instead, as confirmation of everything she had already learned, a final closing of a door she had worked so hard to shut properly, rather than simply walking away from unfinished. She did not need his apology to feel complete. She had already found completeness on her own, built through the quiet, steady work of choosing herself first, and discovering, in the process, exactly what it felt like to be chosen fully in return by someone who never needed a crisis to notice her value in the first place.